We are able to welcome our guest here today because of our friends at the University of Utah. The Ancient Near Eastern Studies program works together with the Department of Religious Studies and some others at the University of Utah who are interested in Jewish and related studies. And so my friend and colleague Natan Devere told me about Tudor's visit to Utah. He will be giving his main lecture actually tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock at the University of Utah on the Lemba people, who are a people in the south of Africa who have a tradition connected with the Ark of the Covenant. So that may catch some of your interest. So if you're able to get up there tomorrow evening, that will be an interesting lecture. I asked Natan if it would be possible for us to bring Tudor down to our campus, and because of Latter-day Saints' interest in Israelite bloodlines, I asked Dr. Parfit if there would be a way he could give a more general lecture about groups of people who claim kinship with the house of Israel. Let me just introduce our guest a bit more, and you'll understand why he is an expert who's able to speak to this issue. Tudor Parfit is Distinguished Professor in the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs at Florida International University, where he is also the Navon Professor of Sephardi Mitzri Jewish Studies and the director of the Global Jewish Studies program. Now, if you will Google him online, you will see that he actually does quite a lot. You'll check his accent in a moment, but he's a British historian, broadcaster, and writer. And so he has traveled widely. In fact, I think one of his bios actually describes him as an adventurer. And he travels widely and speaks widely on some of these issues. And he's had a number of publications as well as the documentaries I've alluded to, just to name a few. In the Shadow of Moses, New Jewish Movements in Africa and the Diaspora, which came out this year, Becoming Jewish, New Jews and Emerging Jewish Communities in a Globalized World, also this year, and Black Zion in 2012. One of the things that may also catch the interest of a Latter-day Saint audience is, he may allude to this in today's presentation, is the use of genetics in either proving or disproving connections with the House of Israel, which of course affects our community in many ways. So without any further ado, I would like us to give a warm welcome to Dr. Tudor Parfit.
Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction, Dr. Huntsman. It's very, very good to be here. It's a very interesting and, of course, somewhat unusual audience for me. And I have a great suspicion of technology in every conceivable form, and particularly this particular one. And so I might choose to ignore it to some extent. I think I know what you're likely to be interested in, and I think that the things that you're going to be interested in are not my introduction. So I'm going to skip the introduction because I think that you will know all about it, because you know all about the lost tribes of Israel in some sort of theoretical way. And your church has been deeply concerned with the issue of the lost tribes of Israel, even from its inception. And it's indeed a fact that the first 3 or 4 decades of the 19th century was perhaps the period in human history when there was the greatest interest in the idea of lost tribes, and particularly in the Americas, and that is, in a way, the backdrop to the beginning of the Latter-day Saints' religious evolution. But that's not what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm very, very interested in the spread of lost tribe mythology, as I would think of it. But what I'm going to talk about is my own personal experience of it over quite a number of years. I think I'd have to start by saying that I'm speaking from a secular point of view, even though I'm a very keen attendant at my own church, which is the Anglican Church. I can no longer think of myself as a believer exactly, but I'm very attached to the traditions of the Christian Church. But I don't necessarily feel obliged to believe everything that I read in the Bible. And one of the things specifically that I personally don't particularly believe in is the idea that the lost tribes of Israel have to be extant at this point in history, or indeed at any point in history. And from my own scholarly and secular point of view, the Lost Tribes really kind of stopped being historically visible, probably 4 or 5 generations after the exile, which created the diaspora in Babylon. Of course, we're not ever absolutely sure about this, but the current indications are, on the basis of contemporary verifiable knowledge, that appears to be the case. But I should also say that to make a distinction between history and fact and myth is a very hazardous undertaking, and it would be a brave man who would underestimate the power and the significance, the importance, and the truth, and you have to understand this, the truth of myth, and this is what I'm going to be trying to address today, the truth of myth in a way. So, quite a number of years ago, I was having dinner in a club, a very fancy sort of conservative British club in London, and somebody asked me if I would go the following week to the Sudan to write a report on Ethiopian Jews who allegedly were being poisoned in the refugee camps along the border with Ethiopia. And I agree, and I agreed, and I turned up in Sudan and got on a little bus which took me across the desert to a place called Gudaref, which is on the border with Ethiopia. And at the time, this was many years ago, it was the time of the great Ethiopian famine. The whole area was filled with refugee camps and grotesquely emaciated people. I'm sure you've seen images of the famine on television and so on. And I wandered around these refugee camps looking for the Ethiopian Jews who were supposed to be there, and eventually I located them. And it just so happened that my arrival in this refugee camp coincided with the beginning of an extraordinary operation on the part of the Israeli government to rescue these Jews and to take them from these stinking and awfully badly organized refugee camps to Israel. And that operation was called Operation Moses. And that, in a way, was the beginning of my own interest in the question of the lost tribes of Israel, because the Ethiopian Jews were permitted to go to Israel as citizens, as free citizens, while being black people from Africa, because of the idea that they formed one of the lost tribes of Israel, namely the tribe of Dan, and that it was on this basis that they could go and settle in Israel. So this was my first lost tribe of Israel. And the story of the Ethiopian Jews is one of the most dramatic stories, and the most exciting stories, I think, in modern Jewish history, how they got from Ethiopia to Israel, what happened when they got there, and of course the mass of myths and legends that surrounds their history. Because ever since, I should think, the 9th century, perhaps a little bit earlier, European society had been convulsed with the idea that somewhere in Africa there would be a kingdom either controlled by the great figure of Prester John or, according to other versions of this basic legend, a kingdom that was dominated by the lost tribes of Israel. And so right from the 9th century well into the 20th century, the idea that the lost tribes of Israel somehow were to be found in the interior of Africa was one of these myths that dominated the ways that Europeans visualized and understood, comprehended the unknown outside world. So we all imagine, I'm sure you as well, you imagine the life beyond Utah. And some of you know it, some of you don't. But anyway, there's a horizon and there's a periphery. And beyond that periphery, you don't really know it so well. You know this world. And the world beyond Utah and beyond your own faith is one that you have to construct really for your own purposes. And thus it was in medieval Europe. They didn't know what was beyond Europe. They had no real conception, and so it was imagined, it was constructed, it was created in the mind. And one of the chief factors in the construction of this outside world was the fact that certainly somewhere the lost tribes of Israel were to be found, that they were a powerful, rich, potent force, and for many people and for many generations, the idea was that they could perhaps at some point in the future be counted on to come to the aid either of Christendom, according to the version, or to Jews as they were being persecuted by Christians in Europe. And a further extension of this idea was that they would somehow outwit the forces of Islam, who were the clear main enemies of Europeans well into the modern period, and still, in a way, can be seen as being so. So this is the background, and Africa was the locus that many of the ideas of the lost tribes, the ideas coalesced around some place in Africa, and very often around Ethiopia. But Ethiopia wasn't the only situs for this myth. Just about every other bit of Africa at some point or another has been associated with it. And I don't think there's a part of the world which has not at some point or another been associated with the lost tribes. From Britain itself, and you've probably heard of the British Israelite movement, Scandinavia, Australia, New Zealand, South America, North America, wherever you go in the world, somebody at some point or another has said, this is where the lost tribes are or have been. So anyway, I had some kind of knowledge of this when I came across the Ethiopian Jews in the Sudan. And while I was there, I illegally crossed the border, and I had already met some of these Ethiopians in the camps, and they started to tell me their stories. And particularly what they said was that they'd been walking in some cases for 3 months from the highlands of Ethiopia, and that on the way they'd been attacked. The girls had often enough been raped. They'd been attacked by bandits, in some cases by wild animals, and they were in an absolutely pitiful state. And they said, if you really want to see what it was like, you have to take the path that we ourselves took here. And they indicated the path, and they told me to travel at night, because if I traveled at day, I'd be shot at by helicopters that patrolled the route down from Lake Gondar. So I traveled at night with a group of Ethiopians, and indeed I saw these people in other evolutions coming down this route from the highlands and making their way to the camps on the border. And one group that I traveled with, we arrived at the border. We crossed the border. There was no control at all at the time, and just in front of where we were, there was a very pitiful-looking UN hut. It was no more than 1 story, but it had a kind of tower. And compared with the pitiful little shacks that were the other buildings in the area, it was reasonably impressive. And the people that I was with, they looked at this and they said, my God, this is amazing. This surely must be the place that we've been traveling towards. This must be Jerusalem. And they threw themselves on the floor and started to worship the ground that they were absolutely certain was Jerusalem. Of course, it wasn't, and it was still a very long route that they had to follow. But I was taken by this community. I was taken by their simple faith, and I was taken by the extraordinary romance, if you like, of their story and of the legend that ultimately led them to be where they were. And a few months later, I was invited to go to a university in South Africa and give a talk on the Ethiopian Jews. And at the back of the hall, something like this, at the end of my talk, I noticed a group of black people who were very, very shabbily dressed. They were barefoot, unlike the wealthy, Johannesburg people who were neatly turned out and so on. And I wandered over to see these people. They were wearing yarmulkes or kippot, Jewish skull caps. And they explained to me that they were Jewish, and they told me they were a lost tribe as well, and they were called the Lemba. And I must have looked pretty dismissive, maybe even a little bit of a sneer was perceived on my face, and they looked a bit disappointed and a bit abashed. And they said, well, all you need to do is to come back with us to our villages, spend a few days, and you will see that what we're saying about ourselves is absolutely true. And so I did. I went up to Venda, where they lived, and spent a weekend. At the end of the weekend, I was pretty sure that the habits and the customs and the stories and the legends that they told me were in some way authentic, and I resolved to write a book about it. And it was an intriguing thing, because they told me they'd come from an unknown place, from a lost city in the north, and the lost city was called Senna. And so I had the idea of somehow walking across Africa, following the traces that the Lemba would lead me to, picking up clues as I went, and trying to find this lost city of Senna. And I spent about 6 months on this journey. It was one of the best times of my life. And eventually I got to the Red Sea, and I was sitting on a beach, looking out towards the ocean, and I had failed to find out where these people had come from. I had failed to find out if they were really the Jewish tribe that they claimed to be. I had failed to find out if they were a lost tribe of Israel, as claimed. But I'd had a great journey, and I went on to write a book that was translated into quite a number of languages, and I was reasonably content, but not completely content, because after all, in my heart of hearts, I hadn't solved the puzzle that I'd tried to resolve in the first place. But a couple of years later, or maybe even the next year, I was in the Yemen, and if ever you have the chance, if you haven't done your mission yet, and you can persuade the authorities to send you to the Yemen, if the position in the Yemen is somewhat more peaceful than it is at the moment, I would strongly urge you to go there, because it's one of the most extraordinary places in the world. And I was talking to I was traveling down through the Hadramaut, which is a great valley which crosses through the Empty Quarter, which is the great desert of Saudi Arabia. And I was speaking to a holy Muslim Mukhtar, and I don't know how holy he was. Anyway, he was an Islamic Mukhtar. And we were having a conversation, and he said, well, what do you do with yourself? And I said, well, I'm a professor of Jewish studies, and I teach Hebrew and Jewish history and this, that, and the other. And he said, well, very interesting, very fine people, the Jews. And he said, what have you been doing recently? And I told him the story about the Lemba and how I'd crossed Africa looking for this mythical place, as I imagined, called Senna. And he clapped his hands together and he said, well, hang on. There's a place right at the end of the Wadi, probably 4 or 5 hours from here. Very ancient place it is too. It used to be inhabited. It used to have a great dam which cracked in about 1200, and since then it's really been abandoned. But I can tell you this, that it used to send its population to Africa. So I thought, maybe this has got something to do with my story. So we took the Land Rover and we went to the end of the Wadi. We found this place. And what I discovered almost immediately was that the people who lived around the area had the same tribal names as the tribal names of my African lost tribe. And I thought, my goodness, this looks as if it might be leading to something rather exciting and interesting. But still, there was no smoking gun. There was no graffiti on the wall which said, the Lemba were here, or the lost tribe went in the direction of Africa, or something like that. Nothing. So then, this was now, getting on towards 1996 or 1997. And this was the moment in history when we were first able to access that history book which everybody carries around inside them, and that is, of course, our DNA. And before that, it had not been possible. It was still very expensive to do. But I had friends in the Department of Genetics at University College London, and together we decided that we would do a major research trip, and we would collect DNA in South Arabia, and we connected, and we would compare it with the Lemba DNA and also with the other populations spread out between the Indian Ocean and the areas where the Lemba live. And so this was a major thing. It took a few months, and we finished up with a nice pile of DNA, and this was shipped off to the genetic wallers in the labs at University College, and then, we got the results. And what was I expecting? Was I really expecting that this would answer my questions? Well, one of the questions, what were my questions? Let's just run through it again. Yeah. Were they really a lost tribe of Israel? That was one question. What was the other question? Yeah.
If that's where they came from?
Were they really from Senna, and were they really Jewish? Right, that was the last thing. So, well, Jews are a religion. Are you going to be able to get anything about Jews as a religion from DNA? That I didn't really think would come through. Were they from Senna? That seemed plausible if this was the Senna that I imagined it might be. So that possible. Lost tribes of Israel, a group that had disappeared from the face of the earth 600 or 700 years before the Christian era. That seemed to me, to be pretty unlikely. So we got the data, and it's the case that just a few months before I was doing this, I was involved in another project, and that project had to do with the Kohanim. Does anybody know what the Kohanim are? The Hebrew word Kohen. Priest, thank you very much. Jewish priests are called Kohanim, and I'm sure that you may have met in your lives or heard of somebody called Mr. Cohen or Mrs. Cohen. Well, if a man is called Cohen, the chances are that he is a priest, and there are various other Hebrew names that Jews use which indicate that he is of priestly origin. And so the idea would be that these people of priestly origin were descended from priests who at one point in history officiated on the temple in Jerusalem. But if you think about it, was there really very much likelihood or chance that Mr. Cohen down the block really had anything to do with, these priests that fill the stories of the Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament, and also your own scriptures? Not really. But anyway, we decided to put this to the test. So we collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Mr. Cohens from all over the world, many of them on the beach in Tel Aviv, as it happens. And we took all of their DNA and we analyzed it. And remarkably, and rather incredibly, well over 50% of these Kohanim, these guys, were descended from a single person, a single man. And we also know that that single man lived in the area of Israel 3,000 years ago. Now, I can tell you individually, or maybe afterwards, how you can determine this through genetics, but believe me, for the moment, you more or less can. Not perhaps with total precision, but you can more or less. So we had this piece, and of course, what would this suggest? This would suggest maybe that the person from whom these 52% of all people in the world who identified themselves as priests or Kohanim were descended from who was the founder of the priestly line. This is something you should know. Aaron, thank you very much. So that they were all descended from Aaron. Okay, now as we started to look at the data coming from the Lemba DNA, well, we found out first of all that on the male side, they were definitely Semitic. Now, what does Semitic mean? Again, this is something that I'm sure you do know. What is Semitic? I beg your pardon? Descended, well, I suppose, yes, descended from Shem. That's absolutely correct. And who are the Semitic peoples then? Who are the people that we think of as being Semitic peoples? Jews and Arabs, people living in that part of the world. And the Semitic languages are Hebrew, Arabic, and Aramaic, and various others. So the determination then was that the Lemba, who are living right in the middle of Africa and who have no Hebrew, no Semitic language, who look exactly the same as other Bantu people living in the same area, but they have this rather peculiar, very unlikely claim to be descended from the lost tribes of Israel, which perhaps was completely fanciful. When we looked at the DNA, what did we discover? We discovered that on the male line, they were indeed Semitic. So something about their claims was clearly true. And then we started digging a little bit deeper. Now, the Lemba are divided into a number of clans. They like to say that there are 12 tribes of the Lemba, and this seems also to reflect, the 12 tribes of Israel. In reality, there are something like 13 and a half tribes, but one of them was a priestly clan called the Buba, and it was a very important clan. And when we looked at the DNA of this important priestly clan, what did we find? We found that 52% of their priestly clan had exactly the same DNA profile as Jewish priests throughout the world. And so the corollary of that is that these guys, these black, Bantu-speaking people with the very fanciful claim, were descended from the same person, plausibly, but not provably, Aaron, who lived some 3,000 years ago in the land of Israel. And of course, as you can well imagine, when I heard this, I felt the sort of shiver that goes down a scholarly spine 2 or 3 times in the course of a career, if you're lucky. And I thought, my goodness, what an extraordinary thing. So what does this show us? It shows us that identity is much more complex than we might possibly have thought, that it's conceivably possible to find Jews in a place that one would never have thought to find Jews, and it also says something about the power of memory, because this tribe probably had been divorced from any knowledge of other Jews or from any knowledge of the Middle East for, who knows, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years, maybe longer. But it says something about the power of memory. And it also says something to us, which we should not forget for a second, and that is that when people tell us things, and when they talk about their traditions, their oral traditions, we should take them very, very seriously. And I'm very glad that I did take this particular legend very, very seriously. So I'll now show you a couple of these images, if it's possible to extract them from this machine. which, as you know, I regard with great suspicion. So I'll just show you a couple here. So these are, you see, Ethiopian Jews. And this is a lemba playing one of their traditional shofars. And this is the rather extraordinary ruin in Zimbabwe, which they associate themselves with, and I think probably with justice. And this is me on my long 6-month journey in a small village in Mposi. And of course, once the story that DNA had proved the oral traditions of a tribe in the rather dramatic way that it did, you know, it became a worldwide story, and I was on 60 Minutes and the full business, and I don't think there was a major newspaper in the world that didn't say something about it. So this is one example. Now you might say, okay, this was a one-off parfit. You're never going to have the same luck again. Well, you're wrong. So there's a very interesting community. We're going now from Africa, across the Indian Ocean, to Western India. And what big city is there in the western coast of India? Anybody know? Big city. Mumbai, thank you very much. Without you, I don't know what we'd do. So there's Mumbai. Just near Mumbai, there's a rather beautiful coastline, which is called the Konkan Coast. And so there's a group there called the Bnei Israel. You can visit them if ever you're in India. It's a fascinating group. Many of them have migrated by now to Israel. But the history of this group is extremely problematic, put it like this. There was no mention of them in any sort of historical source until about 1760, and even that source is, I think, dubious. The Bnei Israel thought of themselves as Jews, as from, let's say, about 1800. They were not thought of as Jews by the other Jews in India. There were quite a number of other Jews in India, both in the south in Kerala and also in Mumbai, which then was called Bombay. And there was no intermarriage between these groups. There was no interdining. If ever the Bnei Israel went into the grand and beautiful synagogues of the other Jews, they were told to sit on the floor. They weren't allowed to sit on the comfortable benches. And even in Israel, they were, generally speaking, looked down upon and despised. Why? Because nobody believed their story. They had a myth of origin which went down, as my grandmother used to say, like a lead balloon. So we thought that we would do some kind of research, genetic research, that might cast some light upon this very dubious community. Why was it dubious? Well, first of all, like the Lemba, they had nothing in common physically, as far as we could see, with any other Jews. They're short, they're black, and what do we know about their traditions? They seem to form part of the Indian caste system. So they had a caste occupation. They were not quite untouchable class, they were slightly above that, but they were embedded in the Indian caste system. The name of their little prayer hall was the same name that Muslims use for describing their mosque. That would suggest that perhaps they were of Islamic origin. And various other things like this. The whole thing was deeply, deeply dubious. They didn't seem to be a Jewish community at all, but they had their legend, which 2,000 years ago they had settled They'd come in a boat, 7 people in a boat, and they'd settled on the Konkan coast. So what did the DNA show? The DNA showed that this is their graveyard on the Konkan, and this is the stele which describes how they got there. And so, as you can see from the Times of India, which is the highest circulation English newspaper in the world, and this was the Times of India on Sunday. As you can see, this is the headline of that particular day, July the 21st, 2002. And a couple of days before that, we'd had a seminar in Oxford where I had revealed the DNA study, which shows, as you can see, that not only were they of Semitic origin and had come from the Middle East at some point in history, but also that some of them carried this haplotype, which is associated with the probably or plausibly the originator of the priesthood. So the very, very nice thing, well, in the case of the Lemba, of course, it was highly gratifying to be able to say to the Lemba, well, you know, this was, you know, your story was right, and I was completely wrong not to fully believe it. And in the case of the Bnei Israel Jews, it was the same. It was the same story. Their response was extraordinary, and the morning after, the Monday morning, after this headline appeared on the Times of India, the streets of Mumbai were full of Bnei Israel who were dancing and rejoicing and feasting because this was the piece of information, this was the proof that they had needed for a couple of years to be able to say to other Jews, look, we're just as good as you are, and this is the evidence, and this was the evidence that they'd been waiting for. And I think it really has changed the profile of the community. So, you know, the takeaway from this particular story, I won't give the same takeaway as the takeaway from the Lemba, it could be a different takeaway, and that is the extraordinary power of genetic research on people's identity. And I wrote a book some few years ago on the subject of identity and genetics, and you're all pretty young in this room, a good deal younger than me, and you've got a few more years to live, and I'm sure that by the time you get to my age, genetics will be so sophisticated and will tell us so much that it's going to be a very, very, very potent feature, not only of your community and your church, but for other people outside it as well. So you're absolutely right to put so much emphasis, I think, on genealogical research and genetic research. But okay, well, these are two pretty, impressive success stories about how linking genetic research and historical and anthropological research, what it can do. And let me just move forward a little bit here. It doesn't always work. So a few years ago, I went to visit my son, who decided to do his MBA in faraway Australia. And so I flew to Sydney, and there were a couple of announcements in the papers, that I was going to be giving my talk and so on. And I got a telephone call in my hotel room, and a guy had called me from Papua New Guinea, from the Gogodala tribe, and he explained to me that he was the spiritual leader of this particular tribe in western Papua New Guinea. And I quickly Googled the tribe after the conversation and discovered that they had been cannibals until about 1950 or so. And he told me that they were in fact a lost tribe of Israel, and that the lost Ark of the Covenant was to be seen if one were to go there in the lagoon. It's a place called the Fly Estuary, and he'd seen it many, many times. He told me the lost Ark of the Covenant, and it shot fire and smoke and lightning into the sky, and it was truly remarkable. And what he really wanted me to do, because he'd seen the stuff that I'd been doing on DNA and the Lemba and the B'nai Israel on the internet, and so he wanted me to go to Papua New Guinea to do the same thing with the Gogodala, this particular tribe. And so in due course, I turned up and I saw more Israeli flags in the capital and subsequently in the villages than I'd ever seen before in my life. And there was a very rapturous and wonderful reception given for me. And these were the people who met me at the airport and who subsequently went with me to the village way in the west. And as you can see, they're impressive looking, and stars of David, you know, Jewish insignia, so to speak, are painted on their faces. And one of the things that I read was that the idea of their being Jewish had been presented to them by Australian missionaries, and they had been particularly impressed by what they thought of as being Jewish noses. And as you can see, they have quite good Jewish noses, if such a thing exists. And so we did. Eventually, I did some DNA studies of the tribe, and not really very unexpectedly. You know, I mean, you can't. I didn't take their story very seriously, to be frank. It's a very long way away from anywhere that the lost tribes could reasonably have got to. But anyway, I took them seriously enough to go there and do the DNA testing and so on. And so I took the results back to the lab in London, and the results were zilch. And but if you're doing this kind of work, you can't just leave it at that. So you have to go back to the people that you've tested, and you have to tell them what the results are. And so I go back to Papua New Guinea. I get off the plane. They're all there. And there are great big banners, "Welcome Parfit, who's come to prove to the world that we're Jews." And DNA revelation about to happen, all of this stuff. And eventually I was taken to an arena with thousands of bare-chested, heavily armed warriors. And I had to stand there and tell them that the results were not exactly as they hoped. And I must admit, I chickened out. And so I said, well, pretty ambiguous, difficult to read, not really in a position absolutely to be categoric one way or the other. So I didn't exactly lie, but I didn't tell the truth either. And I was right, because in the audience, looking around, everybody was black, except this girl. And she was looking at me in a very sort of penetrating way. And so once I'd managed to escape the daggers and the spears and the assegai and so on and so forth, I wandered over to speak to this lovely girl. And I said, "What are you doing here?" And she said, "Well, I'm Jewish." I said, "Oh." And I'd read about your research. I live in the capital. And she told me her story. It was an amazing story. So the story was that her grandfather was a Jew from Malta. And in the Second World War, fleeing the Nazis, he got as far as Australia on a troop carrier, couldn't find work, proceeded to Papua New Guinea, where he started a little business, and he married a Papua woman, and he insisted that they were all Jewish, and they kept a kosher home and all the rest of it. And this was the produce of the union. And she said, "Well, you know, in the capital there aren't any other Jews. We're the only Jews." And we heard that this Gogodala I always thought they were cannibals, but anyway, you say they're Jews. And so I came and found myself a husband. And she'd found herself a husband. And that was the reason that she was there. And so as I looked at this great crowd of warriors, the truth of the matter was that there was some DNA there, which had some kind of relationship with the Jewish people. And I went back once again, because I wasn't really very satisfied with the way in which I'd delivered the truth of their history, and it was necessary to be a little bit more nuanced. And once again, I arrive at the airport. This time the reception was a little muted compared with previous occasions. But there was somebody there saying, "You must come and see this girl, Esther. She demands that you see her immediately." So I went straight from the plane to her little house on the outskirts of the capital. And she opened the door and she said, "Come in quickly, I've got something to show you." And what she had to show me was a very small baby. And she put the baby in my arms and she said, "It's called Tudor." So I was very pleased that I'd been given the honor of naming her child. So I think probably the time has come for me to belt up. And just to conclude, you know, the world is a much more complex place than we imagine. The legends that float around come from all sorts of different sources. And, you know, the past is, it's a cliche to observe as another country, and it takes assiduous work to understand it, or to understand, indeed, anything at all. And sometimes in life and in scholarship, you know, you get surprises. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank again Dr. Parfit for joining us. We just have a few minutes before the bell rings for the next period classes. Are there a couple questions that you would like to pose before we let him go off to lunch? Dr. Parfit? Dr. Johnson?
Did you ever do any DNA studies on the Colossus?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I haven't personally done any DNA studies on the Ethiopians, but people have. And what those DNA studies show is that they have no link with the, you know, with the Jewish people biologically. And that is unusual, because if you look at all of the tribes, if you like, of the Jewish people, no matter where they are, from the Yemen to South India to China and so on, or let's say, you know, Hungary or Germany or France or wherever, they're all linked with lengths of DNA which indicate their place of origin. The place of origin for all Jews, with a couple of exceptions, is the Eastern Mediterranean. So if you look at the DNA of Jews and then compare it with the DNA, let's say, of Palestinians or the Druze people or Eastern Cypriots, it's all pretty much the same, except for the Ethiopians. They are completely Ethiopian. So it's not that Israelites got to Ethiopia, it's rather that Judaism in some form or another got to Ethiopia. Yeah.
What happened to the Ark of the Covenant?
Go to tomorrow night's lecture.
Well, you could do that, but you don't have to come tomorrow. I'll tell you what happened to that particular Ark of the Covenant, which is that, you know, as I said, you know, if I hear something, I will take it seriously. And so I went with an amazing guy who had been an abalone diver in Australia. And so he was all kitted up with his gear, and we went into this miserable, muddy swamp where the Ark of the Covenant in Papua New Guinea was supposed to be. And we both dived away and splashed around, and there was no sign of anything that resembled anything. So the whole thing was complete and utter invention, which was intended, and very successfully so, it was intended to make me go there. Yeah.
I find it interesting the emotional investment that these different tribes have in the validation of their identity. Can you speak to that, that sort of emotion, the attachment to knowing who they are and having that confirmed?
Well, I think that it's a very, very good and subtle and intelligent question. Why would they need this kind of validation? Why would they get pleasure from this kind of validation? Well, I think very largely because of the insults that they had to live through. And I mean, you must surely, at this particular university, this particular community, be well aware of that as a problem when so many people in the world don't take your religion and its origins seriously. And thus it was with the Lemba, whose claims to be Jewish had been ignored and ridiculed for at least 100 years by South African Jews. Thus it was with the Bnei Israel in Western India, whose claims to be Jewish had been ridiculed and rubbished by the local Jewish community and many other people besides. And so to have validation in the face of systematic rejection is, of course, welcome. So I think that's the answer to that question.
All right, thank you again.